Now, this podcast is usually not very topical, but in this case, we are talking about something that happened last week. Protests down in New Zealand and Maori cultural conversation. And I want to talk to Will Spencer about that because he used to live in New Zealand just like I did. But the conversation is going to be more than that. It's going to be a lot less topical because he's lived in a bunch of other countries as well. We're getting into all kinds of cultures, everywhere from South America to Asia, and the way that it all ties back to our responsibilities here in the United States. Welcome to another T-Rex Talk. Today we have a guest he's traveled the world. That's the main thing that I want to talk to Will about. Will, you have traveled the world, and we have a topic, something that just happened in the news in New Zealand. But I want to get to some of the other places that you have traveled. So why don't you introduce yourself and your podcast?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Will Spencer. I'm the host of the Will Spencer podcast. You may have heard it referred to as the Renaissance of Men previously. I changed the name, and I came to Christ in 2020 after a 4-year journey around the world exploring the religions and traditions of the world, which is what led me to New Zealand, which you and I have in common. So God called me out of that just before COVID and called me to him. And so I'm grateful to get the chance to talk about my experiences with you. Are you there? Can you hear me?
I'm still here, yeah.
Oh.
I can. You broke up for a second, but we can just keep rolling with your
yeah. Oh, I just gave my introduction. Did you not hear it?
You broke up for a little bit, and if you finish your introduction, then that's great. We'll just pick up at the end of the introduction.
Yes.
So we have talked. We've talked offline a little bit. We met in person. I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks now, and we've had some really interesting conversations. I think we've had interesting conversations already about this. But
I agree.
Let's start with New Zealand. So I've never seen New Zealand as prominently in the news as it just was, probably since Lord of the Rings times. Like the last time New Zealand was this talked about on social media. They had just won a whole bunch of Oscars for Return of the King. But there was a clip making the rounds of a few members of the Maori Party of New Zealand tearing apart a bill that was up for consideration, a bill that had been submitted by the ACT Party, and they were protesting this bill by tearing it up and beginning the haka, which is the Maori war dance, and a whole bunch of people in the gallery started chanting and stamping, and then the members of Te Pāti Maori and a couple of other friendly, I think, Green Party reps. I've actually lost track of the members of parliament down there, so I can't remember which party everybody goes with anymore, but the usual suspects got up to their feet and carried on with the haka in the middle of, again, this is Parliament. This is British parliamentary procedure. And the speaker was gaveling, and they were not listening and stamping and chanting and waving hats and doing stuff that if you watch it with the sound off, it actually looks like some kind of minstrel show. It's actually embarrassing on a number of different fronts. But yeah, that clip made the rounds, tens of millions of views on Twitter, hundreds of millions of views probably across all the social media outlets. And it was pretty polarizing. The usual suspects that like that sort of thing thought it was a great show of strength. And then the usual suspects on the other side were like, this is a problem. This is not how parliamentary procedure is supposed to be conducted. What were your thoughts when you saw the clip? Because you live in New Zealand, you're familiar with the haka, you're familiar with the Maori, you're familiar with some of the stuff that is talked about there in the country. Give me your immediate thoughts.
So I was in New Zealand just before COVID. In fact, I left the first week of February 2020. COVID happened weeks later. I left, COVID was not really a thing yet. So I was like Han Solo blowing out of the Death Star, looking over my shoulder like, oh, I was lucky. But I remember when I was there seeing the attempt to integrate the Maori culture with the Pakeha culture, the white settler culture. So New Zealand had previously been a British, or it still is, I guess, a British Commonwealth country. That was its primary identity, much like Canada, South Africa, et cetera. But it seems to me over the past probably 10 years, I don't have a good sense, that there was a rising attempt to try and say, well, we're going to be bicultural. So we're going to be a white Western country, but we have these indigenous Maori people. And so we want to fuse these two cultures together and go from being New Zealand to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Like, that's how we will identify, even if the world doesn't call us that. That's who we're going to be. We're going to be a bicultural nation, both Maori and Pakeha, and that's just who we're going to be as a country. And I thought when I was there in 2019, I thought if there was one country on earth that could pull off something like that, it would be New Zealand, because I felt that the people were kind, they were well-intentioned. It felt at the time, especially because the Maori lived in poverty and very difficult conditions, that there really was a spirit of like, well, this is who we are as a unique island nation. Let's just do this and let's actually try. So that was the last time I tuned in. So when I saw that video, whatever, 2 or 3 days ago, I was like, oh yeah, okay, post-COVID, that makes sense that is the direction that this would go, that it ultimately would not be bicultural. It's just another woke attempt at cultural dominion over the white culture, asserting the primacy of Maori culture over white culture. So that didn't surprise me, even though it was kind of disappointing.
Yeah. And the bill that was up for consideration, so New Zealand has a very interesting history. New Zealand is a small enough country landmass-wise that when it was colonized by the British, it was done in pretty much a single chunk. There were more British folks on the North Island and more Scottish and Irish folks on the South Island. But generally speaking, this was late enough in the colonial game, like America had been colonized, India had been colonized. This is early 1800s, mid-1800s that most of this is happening. So colonization has been boiled down to kind of a science. There's a procedure. It's extremely straightforward. New Zealand is the most remote country from England, and it's extremely far from other nations. So like, there's a lot of ocean between New Zealand and Australia. And it is a very interesting, it's one of the last places to be colonized. And in some ways, it's one of the most successful stories. The Maori were Christianized and integrated, and the intermarrying of the Maori with the colonists was so extensive that there are basically no full-blood Maori anymore. There was no segregation. It was total adoption. Now, there were many Maori tribes that wiped themselves out, because they were very warlike tribes, and as soon as they had access to muskets, the musket wars started. So there was a very bloody period after the colonial folks showed up, but it wasn't the colonial governments that were doing this, like you would have seen, for example, in Australia. And so it's just a really interesting place to look at. It's small enough that things happen quickly. It's late enough that the technology and the record keeping is quite good. It is a really fascinating case study of colonialism, and New Zealand is a small enough landmass that it happened pretty quick, but it's a big enough landmass that there was tons of room. The South Island had almost nobody on it at all. Even today, the South Island feels like it has almost nobody on it. There's lots of the southern part of the South Island you can go to, and it's just open. Yep. So it is really interesting to look at, because it is like a little microcosm of a lot of these ideas. And you mentioned that the Maori are in poverty in a lot of places. The Maori neighborhoods are often the poorer neighborhoods once you get into South Auckland and places like that. And I believe that a lot of that happened relatively recently. And kind of in the same way that in the States, you have neighborhoods, really low socioeconomic level neighborhoods in certain parts of cities, and that's where the African American communities are. But a lot of that is relatively recent. It isn't necessarily the way that things have always been. A lot of times those are neighborhoods that used to be more affluent 40, 50 years ago. So it's a really interesting thing to study. But my understanding, having lived there and watching a generation gap, I was friends with older Maori and I was friends with younger Maori, and there was just a very different mentality between the two. They both talked about heritage quite a bit, but the older Maori were talking about stuff that they remembered, and the younger Maori were talking about stuff that they'd been taught in school. And they'd been taught about the colonial oppression that they learned about in school. They weren't learning about it necessarily from the older generation. Yeah, and the Maori culture that I learned about from the elders is different than the Maori culture that I see people doing in the beehive, in Parliament right now. It's a very different sort of flavor and style about it. And so yeah, my take is that this current resurgence, the Maori Renaissance that people talk about, people started talking about in the 70s. A bunch of laws were passed that enabled it in the 80s. So things like the Maori language TV channel is something that got put into place with some law reforms in the 80s, giving Maori their own protected seats in Parliament, regardless of how many votes they get. That's a pretty recent thing. Like, a lot of these things are very recent things that are supposed to help. Way more welfare money available to Maori communities that are on the dole. Like, all of these things were added pretty recently, in the same way that we saw a bunch of stuff get added during the civil rights movement in America in the 60s. So a lot of what you're seeing is, I guess the 60s are not super recent. In New Zealand history, the 80s are, from the 80s till now, is actually a pretty big chunk of their national history compared to Britain, for example. But these are all relatively recent changes. And one of the things that was in the bill was basically removing some of these specialized protected things from the New Zealand law. It's not rewriting the Treaty of Waitangi from the 1800s. It's about rewriting some of the stuff that was put into place, some of the regulatory stuff that was put in place in the 80s. Things like Maori will no longer get preferential treatment inside of the health system. So right now, New Zealand has universal health care, and if you can afford it, you avoid that and you do private health care. But if you don't, you do public health care. And if you are a Maori or Pacific Islander of some sort, you have a shorter waiting list than if you're a Pakeha. So there are certain things like that are inequalities that the bill was trying to get rid of, and that was what led to the kickoff of the resistance and the protest and so forth. And there's another kind of change here. Like, I believe that 10, 15 years ago, the American media would have been universally in favor of this brave, bold resistance of these people, standing up in the middle of Parliament, shouting down the actual Speaker of the House, stomping, etc. But I think that people are a little bit past that, generally speaking, on the internet. What is your take?
I agree. I mean, they made a really big mistake by having that little demonstration after the American presidential election, because I think that day,
yeah.
I think that was a sea change, not just in American history, but in world history. Like, in the sense of, and I don't mean like in the 1,000-year long view. I mean, like, just in the general trajectory. Who knows how it will actually end up looking, but it just felt there was this enormous collective sigh of relief, this big shift where everyone just kind of said, okay, I'm so glad we're done with that woke stuff. Like, really, like, when you see, I think it was last night, the night before, 2 nights ago, Donald Trump shows up at the UFC fight, with Dana White and with RFK and with Elon Musk. And, you see all these, you see a big group of men, like Tulsi Gabbard was not.
Yeah, the previous generation's favorite Democrats.
Exactly. Oh, that was a great meme going around like, welcome to today's Democrats. But you see them showing up, and Tulsi Gabbard is not there. No disrespect to Tulsi Gabbard, but it was absolutely a show of manhood, of masculinity, of men. The men are back in charge after we had surrendered leadership. When I say we, I don't necessarily mean you and me, but our forefathers in many ways surrendered leadership to a form of feminism. And so what I noticed about that little Maori display was, like, it's a woman leading it, right? And women don't do hakas. Haka is a man thing, right? Women have their own.
I was going to say,
double feminism.
I was going to say, the old guys that I knew who were in their 60s and 70s, some of them still had moko, still had the tattoo, and that had gone away until about 15 years ago. It was either super old guys that still had it, and then recently young people have started to get it. But they were like, women are not allowed to do the haka.
That's right.
This famous haka that just happened was led by an extremely young woman. I forget her name, and I don't want to mispronounce it, but yeah, she starts it off. She's a young AOC type, bright young thing, and she starts the haka, and the men of the Maori party stand up and follow her lead, which is another
right.
kind of interesting shift. But go on with
No,
your...
I mean, that's basically it, is that I think the 2024 election in America was a massive repudiation of all things feminism, right? It's like, okay, we're done with that. At least for the moment, we're done with that. Doesn't mean the battle's over, but it was just like a giant putting away of like, yeah, no, we're and plenty of men and women are done with that silliness because they saw it was getting them nowhere. So that was a big sea change that happened, coming up on 2 weeks ago now, praise God. So, but then the Maori, they made the mistake of doing that display in a moment, an environment where everyone's like, this now looks really silly. Had you done it a month ago, maybe the entire media would have risen up. Oh, what a brave display of women's empowerment, and what a brave display of indigenous rights and all that. But as it was, it looked extraordinarily tone deaf, and you had this rising spirit of men being like, yeah, that's silly, and now we're gonna make fun of that.
Yeah, and I do think that some of that the change after American election, Donald Trump, the return of Donald Trump, I think has changed a lot massively. But I also think that something that has happened, we don't see it as much in America, but I think worldwide, people have gotten pretty tired of the haka, because one of the things that happens if you are in any country other than America, you watch the rugby, you watch 12 or Tri Nation, whatever it is that you watch, the World Cup, whatever rugby you watch, eventually you see the Tall Blacks or you see some other New Zealand group come out. And the New Zealand teams always get to do the haka, and other teams don't really have something similar. You stand during the anthem, but the rugby teams have to stand still so that the New Zealand team can come and do the haka at them, and they're not allowed to turn their backs or they get fined. They're not allowed to, step closer or they get fined. Like,
I had no idea.
It's this very it's this thing that has been, I believe, kind of overdone. And there are stories of the haka that I love. I love some of the stories that I've read about volunteers from New Zealand in World War I climbing out of their trenches to do the haka. I like, that is the sort of thing that inspires you to have an appreciation for this warrior culture. But being told that you have to stand still while the All Blacks do the haka in front of you again, and if you look the other way, you get fined. This is not ingratiating. This is not inspiring. I think people are kind of tired of it around the world, that have had to see it at all their rugby matches for the last as long as they can remember.
I had no idea that was the case. I mean, I've watched a lot of those videos and I thought they were really cool. I'd never really thought of it that way. Yeah, there does seem to be a way that New Zealand has decided to brand itself using the haka. And so maybe now it's like, that's kind of wearing a little thin. Like, thanks, guys. That was a neat little cultural. But I had no idea that rugby teams were fined. I had no idea that it's kind of imposed. And it's a little strange to say that that's the case, because I've seen some of the famous All Black hakas, like when the All Blacks went to the World Championship 2014, something like that was. And that was a very famous haka just because it was in New Zealand, I guess. And it was a very powerful moment for the nation. But I had no idea that it's like, oh yeah, all these games, we impose this on you and you have to deal with it. And it's like, okay, guys, we're kind of over that now.
Yeah.
You know what? I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can, when you make people like stuff,
yes,
and you punish them if they don't. Few things make something as unlikable as that. So
that's right.
So that's been fascinating, sort of to watch that. And I can see this pendulum swinging in a whole bunch of different cultural areas. Like, people used to love Marvel movies, and now Disney says that you have to like Marvel movies, even the bad ones, for political reasons. Like, you have to like the more woke stuff. You can't just like the old original Marvels. You have to like the new replacement stuff. The Disney movies, you have to like the new Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because the young lady who plays Snow White is a political firebrand who calls people out. Like, that's the reason that you have to support that movie. Like, it's interesting how there is this sort of, you are morally required to like this thing that normally is purely a matter of your own personal opinions or affections or entertainments or whatever. And I think that the pendulum is starting to swing back on that, because you see things like Disney Star Wars shows getting ignored by people, and then people get criticized for ignoring. How dare you ignore this critical, important moment in Star Wars history? And it's like, man, I didn't really need to see lesbian space witch Star Wars. I just I was told it wasn't for me, so I didn't watch it. And since I wasn't watching it, I unsubscribed from Disney Plus, and so now your numbers are down. And I just don't think I need to be scolded for that. So there's a pendulum that I think has been swinging across a bunch of different areas, and you're probably right. Trump is a big part of it, which means Trump will get blamed for even more of it. But I think that it's deeper, bigger, larger, and the pendulum's been swinging for longer.
Oh, yeah. Trump. It's not about Trump per se. Like, I didn't even look at this election as Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. I looked at it as two organizing principles for society. It was essentially, patriarchy versus matriarchy is really what it was. Like, Kamala Harris had nothing behind her. There was no substance to her, her campaign. She had no accomplishments. She never won a single electoral vote. She didn't even earn her own nomination. It was handed to her by Joe Biden without any real contest, right? And so this is an example of this kind of wokeness that had proceeded all the way to the very tops of American politics. Meanwhile, whatever you may say about Donald Trump, certainly he's a father, he's a grandfather, he's a patriarch, he's built businesses, he's of course failed many times, but he had a record. He actually won an election in 2016, so he had something to run on. So there's actual accomplishment versus being handed everything. There's a patriarchal man versus a childless woman, right? A product of feminism versus a product of male legacy. Of course, the Trumps, it's not a Christian family, but there's a lot of generational wealth, Christian values built in. And so it was really a worldview clash. And I think it caused a lot of conflict between people, between families for that reason. And decisively, the world, like America, chose. And I think it was such a big relief because ultimately, for years, I think people just wanted to cast off this wokeness. They felt the heavy burden of it, the need. Like, it's not just about watching the Star Wars or not watching the Star Wars. You have to watch it and you have to like it, or you're a terrible person. If you watch it and you don't like it, it doesn't matter. You have to watch it and you have to like it and you have to accept the heavy hand of this propaganda placed upon you. And if you even say like, yeah, I think men and women are different, just something as simple as that can get you canceled. And people felt that for a long time and they were desperate for a return to sanity. And that's what I think Trump represents. Whether he will be that or whether he is that is another question. But he represents that, a return to more traditional values. Hopefully. And that's another conversation.
Yeah. Well, before we leave multiculturalism or different cultures, when you traveled the world and you were 4 years on the road, where are some of the places that you went? Because you went off the beaten path specifically.
Yes.
You went and you saw not Disneyfied simulated culture. You went and you saw the actual real thing. So where were some of the places you visited?
Yeah, so I've been to developed countries like the United States, Japan. I've been to developing countries like Peru and China, and I've been to countries that will never develop, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, places like that. So I've seen a pretty broad spectrum. So I started in South America, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador. I'm missing one, Chile. I've been to Asia, so Japan, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong. I've been to Oceania, so Australia, New Zealand, some of the outlying islands, and I've been a little bit through Southeast Asia, so Thailand, and then a good bit of time also South Korea, Sri Lanka, India, and then finally to Nepal. So that was the journey.
Okay.
Previously, I'd been to England, France, Germany, Spain, and Morocco. I've also been to Israel, and I'm sure I'm missing a couple nations in there as well.
Now, as you're traveling through these nations, you're not just backpack Instagramming. No. You are in search of something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, what I would have said at the time when I left to travel is that I was looking for God. So I didn't grow up in the church. I actually grew up in a Jewish family, and then I sort of came of age in Northern California, right at kind of the peak of the rave scene and Eastern mysticism and all of that flooding of like Terence McKenna and all that into popular consciousness. So that's when, like, really when a lot of things, not necessarily just yoga, but a lot of psychedelics really started making their way into the youth subculture of the current generation. So the next iteration of the 1960s, you might say. So this was in the 90s and the 2000s. And so I would have said, and I did say at the time, that I was looking for God. I didn't really know what that meant, but I think it would have meant a couple different things at least, which is to say, have experiences, firsthand experiences of the way different cultures and traditions conceptualize of God, and then also a lot of figuring out what God means for me with internally driven type experiences. So ayahuasca would be a really good example. So I've done 15 ayahuasca ceremonies, and we could talk about that as well. But it was looking for something both outside myself and within myself. The only places that I really knew to look.
Mm. Yeah, and so you went to places that have strong religious cultures where, like some of these different groups in Peru and throughout other places, like their culture is still heavily anchored to their spirituality, still heavily anchored to their religion. And then I'm sure you saw the opposite of that. When you go to France, you see these giant cathedrals and people are like, oh, no, we don't do that anymore. We haven't done that in centuries, So as you're going through these things and you're searching, this is not confirmation bias. You're not, I grew up Christian. I grew up believing the Bible in a family that read the Bible. So that was my lens. That was my filter for basically all of my life. Whenever I have traveled to some of these places, I have come at it as a presuppositional Christian. I've already read the Bible. I've already read a little bit about the culture. I already have opinions, but you were going in fresh. So what were your main takeaways as you started to go into some of these cultures and experience their spirituality on their own terms, also looking to see what they had? What were your first, first experience when your eyes wide open? What was it like?
So I don't want to say that I didn't have any framework, because I did. I just didn't understand that I did at the time. Yeah. So my framework.
Everybody has culture. Everybody has a religious framework that's built into them by the time they're like 4. But yes. I didn't want to pretend like you were a complete blank slate or anything. But you had preconceived notions as you traveled. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important just because I happen to have the book here. So there's this book, Psychology as Religion by Paul Vitz, and it's sort of about a modern form of religion that has developed in the West called selfism, which everything ultimately ties back to the development and exploration of the self. So that was my framework that I was traveling with. So I didn't have a Christian framework. I didn't have a Jewish framework. I had an experiential, self-driven framework, not in a selfish, let me take, but in a sense of like, I'm part of the exploration of other is the exploration of self. That's a particularly modern religion that's developed. And that's what this book by Paul Vitz is about. It's very good. So what did I first see? Well, the first thing that I started to see was that all these different traditions around the world had very different conceptualizations of the divine, right? So, but ultimately they could, at some sense, be reconciled with this notion that all is one, that all the streams would, if you followed them long enough, it didn't matter where you began, all the streams would ultimately get to a place of called monism, all is one, and pantheism, all is God. We might call this naturalism. Nature is all there is, and nature is itself God. And so I started seeing that, and that was a very strange experience, because that makes sense. It makes logical sense to look at, unless you have special revelation, but that's a whole other conversation. We should get to that. But I was trying to figure out how all these things fit together and how they could be reconciled. So I would say that I was in the New Age world is probably a very fair way to put it. And one of the things that the New Age world does is it says, well, we have ayahuasca and this indigenous tradition. We have this Native American tradition, but we also have Buddhism, and we also have Hinduism, and then you have Zen, and you have UFOs and psychedelics, and it's this big soup. And the thing is, like, that may make sense from within that world, but if you were to take, let's just say Buddhists, and you were to put them in the same room with, say, Shipibo people of the Amazon, these people would not get along. they would not look at each other and be like, oh yeah, we totally believe the same thing. They would actually, they would be at war with each other, and there would be conflict. Let's put it that way. They would consider their worldviews in conflict, but the New Age does not consider those two worldviews to be in conflict. And so I started noticing that, and that was like a dimly dawning kind of growing realization that I'm having all these different experiences, but where is it all pointing to, and how do they all fit together? And so that was the first thing that I kind of encountered.
Interesting. Yeah. How did that make you? You continued traveling, continued exploring, continued talking to folks, but as this realization that you leave California's big blob of psychic mucus, as I think P.G. O'Rourke called it, and you go out and you start experiencing the source material.
Yes.
And you realize that the source material does not fit together. You kept traveling, and did you keep noticing that? Was that just was that a constantly growing realization for you as you went from South American natural religion to Asian natural religion? Was that a constant noticing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that other things started to be paired with it. So, for example, I learned about the existence of evil, right? Meaning things that are genuinely, objectively, morally reprehensible. In my case, it was learning about Jeffrey Epstein and stuff like that. So once I had learned about that, I was like, okay, I'm being told that all is one and all is God. But I'm supposed to look at that, and I'm supposed to say that that somehow is God, that I'm over here trying to be a good person, and cool, I'm God, great. But I'm supposed to look at that person and say that person is equally God for me, like equally God as me. I think that that led to some sort of challenges of like, well, then what good is good or evil? And yet people are saying like they know that good and evil is a thing because you have societies that organize themselves around good and evil. But if good and evil doesn't exist, like how are we supposed to live? And so that was a friction point for me. That was another friction point that got added to it. And just the third thing that I'll add is I spent 6 months traveling around India with just a small backpack. And I saw all four corners of the country, essentially. And going from a place like, for example, Japan. Japan is probably the most well-organized, safe, and clean country in the world. They certainly have many of their own challenges. But going from Japan, which is probably the peak of sort of technological modernity on Earth right now, to a place like India, where there is no tourist bubble. When you go to India, you are in India. Like maybe there are some places in Mumbai that begin to replicate kind of the modern feel of some American cities, but that's kind of it. Maybe in some of the southern, more tech heavy kind of cities as well. But in general, India feels like it's probably felt like for thousands of years. And this was the same Earth. And so I was trying to figure out, and India and Japan aren't that far away from each other. It's not a long flight. So I was trying to figure out, how can there be two countries on this other side of the world that are so different in terms of their modernization, in terms of their safety, in terms of their cleanliness, right? Just literally night and day. How can these both be on the same planet, and what could possibly account for these differences? And so I would take those two as sort of extreme ends of either pole, and then I would compare them to America. And that's what started getting a lot of the wheels turning for me about what makes America such a unique nation in the world.
So what was the process then after that? Once you realized that America was unique, did you think your way into becoming a Christian?
No, I did not actually. What had happened was
I'm shocked. I'm shocked that that's not what happened.
Well, so I'm imagine me coming back from New Zealand actually to bring it out to kind of tie all the things in a bow in 2020. So all this stuff is in my head in February 2020 when I leave New Zealand, conclude my travels, and move back to the United States. I live in Phoenix now, and that's where I moved at the time. And so all this stuff is percolating in my mind as COVID begins to happen. And I'm having all these questions about evil and multiculturalism and countries with more religious moral foundations and all is one. And none of it makes any sense at all. Right. But I know that there's a notion of good and evil. That must be a thing. I could not let that go. And so into that environment, you put me in that environment, and then COVID starts to happen, and I'm watching like essentially evil spread around the world. I'm watching globalist medical tyranny, descend upon humanity, and all the doorways to world travel that I had been enjoying for 4 years, they all slammed shut. Like suddenly the whole world goes into lockdown individually and collectively. And so here I am in this new apartment, empty because I didn't own any furniture except for I just bought a bed. Essentially, I literally bought a bed on March 21st, which was the day the lockdowns happened, and that was all I owned. So I'm in this, 1-bedroom apartment with no furniture, as tyranny is descending over the world. And so into that environment, you inject the book Simply Christian by N.T. Wright. And so N.T. Wright is talking about how, now, again, I'd had very limited exposure to Christianity, from my life. I would say that I probably had 3 sincere touches of Christianity. The first was a friend of mine in 2001 who I worked with. He was probably a pre-mill kind of dispensationalist Christian. I was going through a tough time, and he basically coerced me into saying the sinner's prayer. And I can tell you that didn't change anything for me, just FYI. And then prior to that, I went to a Jesuit Catholic high school, didn't hear the gospel at all while I was there. And then I was very fortunate to meet a group of Christians at Burning Man in 2015, which was my real introduction to Christ. But that's perhaps a separate rabbit hole we can go down.
As I think I've told you, I have never met anybody who got saved at Burning Man. You are the first, and I'd love to know if there's more out there. But I think that's one of the most unique things. Of all the amazing, unique things that you've done, that's possibly the most unprecedented.
It might be. Now my friends who I met there, I didn't actually get saved at Burning Man. That was the first time that I would say that I met real Christians who were able to embody the gospel to me. And that was very
good clarification. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was something about them that stood out from the rest of the environment. Now, they had been going for 12 years. At that point, they went for 15 years in total. So this is 2015 when I met them. Their last year, I think, was 2017, 2018. And during that time, they would have interacted with thousands of people, most likely. Now, I don't actually know how many people after that point followed up, got baptized, and became believers. I should probably ask them, but they got one. So that is, and actually, just real quick, that was one of the cool things about being at Fight, Laugh, Feast and meeting you and a bunch of other people, because this is just my testimony. Like it's normal to me. Like it's just who I am. And so going to Fight, Laugh, Feast and talking to people who have been believers for their whole lives, I got a much different sense of just how unique that is from within a Christian worldview in a way that I hadn't really I thought it was a cool story. People liked it, but to be in that environment and talk to people and to see their reaction, like, you what? It was a profound wake up call for me about how significant that is and how great God is as well. I want to stress that. Yeah.
Now, I don't want to be too negative about Burning Man, but I also don't know that it's possible to be too negative about Burning Man.
You can't.
I have friends who basically everybody that I know and knew before they started going to Burning Man is a Christian who has turned his back on the faith. So I love meeting people who have encountered the faith at Burning Man. So that's part of the reason for I have plenty of other opinions about Burning Man, but that is my personal friends that go to Burning Man are ex-Christians. And so that's one of the reasons that I find your testimony kind of funny, but mostly just really enjoyable and encouraging. So but also unique.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk to them. I mean, I went 3 times, 2003, 2013, and 2015. So I went in 2003 when the festival was still relatively small at 30,000 people, and you could walk across it. When I went back 10 years later, I mean, in truth, just for context, in 2003, no one could talk about going to Burning Man. If you were working, were working, you would say like, oh, I'm going to a family reunion. That was the thing that everyone would say at the end of August. But by 2013, certainly by 2015, and absolutely now, you're uncool if you don't go to Burning Man. Like, it's almost mandatory for high-level executives in the tech world to go.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a big change. And so I was able to see over 10 years, I got to see that evolve, and it's changed quite a bit. So I can talk about what it was at one stage, and then perhaps at the beginning stages of what it has since become.
Yeah. Well, when I think about Burning Man, I haven't attended. It's become so cool that it's probably not worth. It's so uniformly cool, so culturally universal that it's almost not worth talking about. But I remember more in the early days when I was following like hackers and the makerspace crowd. There was this very strong neo-paganism angle to Burning Man. There was a socialist angle where it's a gifting economy, but there was a huge amount of, obviously, the Burning Man himself is a spiritual figure. He is an object of worship and destruction. And then people bring art cars that are not just for art. They are idols. They are specific historical pagan gods, or they are like everything is very steeped in this kind of neo-paganism, which is very distasteful to me on two levels. Kind of the same way, getting back to New Zealand, as the new haka is. The old paganism, even of New Zealand, is horrible bloodshed, cannibalism, worship of demons, all kinds of stuff. But I don't want to forget that. I don't want to whitewash it. I don't want to forget that it happened. I don't want to lose the story of those Maori people who grew up in that culture and became convinced by the missionaries, or became touched by the Spirit of God and became Christians. The conversion of those people to be Christians is like my people. I'm mostly Scandinavians. Like my pagan ancestors were awful, just the worst possible bloodthirsty, torturous people that you can imagine up in Scandinavia. And their story is one of great redemption into becoming Christian peoples and Christian nations. I don't want to lose sight of the horribleness that came first. I don't want to whitewash it into How to Train Your Dragon or something like that. And I don't want that to happen with the Kiwis. And so when I see something like Burning Man that is pre-Disneyfied kind of, just neo-paganism, where it's like, no, worshiping these demons is just you make a cool car with a propane flamethrower in the front. It's like, guys, what are we doing? Yeah. This is, you are doing the worst of both worlds. And it's kind of what happens with the Hakaization of the Maori is when you get rid of, when you erase the true nature of the Christian colonization and the conversion that happened, when you get rid of those details, you're also getting rid of the true history of the Maori. It is one of the most disrespectful things that you could do to the culture and actual heritage of a nation is if you just be like, yeah, let's forget about the cannibalism. To be truly honoring to the culture and to be honest with the history would be that you keep that stuff and not to just like, nope, everything is just a haka, and everything is just this external stuff, and everything is just like How to Train Your Dragon and Vikings, and everything is just welded art cars with flamethrowers in them. That is the beauty of pre-Christian paganism, and it's just nonsense. Like it's a Disney Plus show.
Yeah. They think that they can sanitize their own memory of themselves, right? So when you and one of the most confronting things that's going on about this is the continual, particularly it's happening in South America and Mexico, the continual unearthing of giant piles of skulls, right? And you begin to see that the high point of pagan civilization. Right. I don't the word pagan is so non-specific now as to almost have no meaning, but we'll go with it just as a broad label. So these Aztec Mayan cities, very high technology, right? For especially, considering the tools that were available. And when you unearth these cities, as archaeologists are doing, they continually find piles of skulls from human sacrifice. And that's a very inconvenient fact. This idea that like these pagan societies, they had very brutal ritualistic practices. When it comes to their gods, or their goddesses, what does it take to propitiate your god? Something sacred, right? Well, what could be more sacred than the blood of your child? And that's what that is the propitiation of these gods with human blood of whether it be captured neighboring tribes, other men, other tribes defeated in war, or children. And we see this biblically. And so the loss of the biblical worldview has come with it, a loss to critically evaluate what all other pagan religions ultimately end up looking like, which is child sacrifice. Right. But no one wants to talk. No one. And that's what's happening in America, I might add, not to exempt us from what's going on. So yes. by abandoning these cultures, by abandoning these people, by not sharing the gospel with them, you are abandoning them to degeneracy and child sacrifice. And somehow Christians have decided that is preferable to being mean, to being, quote, colonialist. Right. And it's a huge tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when this happens, people are being left to, at best, I mean, I don't believe in that this description of Christianity is accurate, but let's say that all Christianity does is save you from an eternity in hell. If that's all that it does,
right.
At best, you are abandoning these people to that. But if Christianity is more than that, if Christianity is not just salvation from an eternity in hell, but it is also the vast improvement of life here on earth, you're also abandoning people to terrible existences here, where you have things like the Aztecs and the Mayans that have these kind of brutal sacrificial systems, just for maintaining cultural. I don't even know the right word for it, because we don't know enough. We don't know enough about their actual history to know how it developed and how it came to this. But yeah, just to please the gods, this was necessary. This kind of life was necessary, and this kind of death was necessary.
Well, I was giving some thought to this. I think if you don't have, and I mentioned this earlier, if you don't have the special revelation of Scripture, if you don't have the Bible, just get rid of it, pretend that it doesn't exist, and you as an individual begin to try and understand reality, it will make sense that you'll have a sense that there is the numinous, like where did I come from? Where did everything come from? And you'll begin to observe things that it's very natural to say they have supernatural. It's natural to say they have supernatural kind of ends. Like, well, there's a sense of spirits. There's a sense of presences, right? The nature isn't just material. There's a sort of mystical spiritual presence that infuses things. And if we want to commune with this natural this supernatural reality, how are we going to do that? Can we make propitiation to them? Can we make supplication to them? And so it's very natural to say that things like sacrifices will develop. It's very natural to say that, various psychedelic and mystical practices will develop as people begin to try to reach out to connect with the divine. That's if you don't have special revelation. If you have special revelation of Scripture, what Scripture reveals is whatever you may think about how reality works is exactly opposite. And I'll give you a good example. All the pagan creation myths ultimately say man came from woman, because that's what we see. When you look around at reality, you see man being born of woman, right? So
I've
ultimately
seen several of my sons get born from a woman. Yes, yeah,
that's exactly.
All of them, in fact, it's amazing. Yeah,
it's incredible how that works. 100% success rate. So, but the thing is, it would be very natural to say then, well, if all men are born of women, and where did humanity come from? Humanity came from nature. So nature is a woman that humanity is born from. So it's very natural that you would conceive of nature as feminine that gives birth to the masculine, right? Special revelation comes along and says, God says, actually, it really didn't happen like that at all. Well, how it actually happened is I made man and I took woman out of man. It's exactly the opposite. That's what God says. And so this is why special revelation is such an affront to many of the world religions, pagan traditions of the world, because it says that what we believe about reality is exactly wrong, right? And so these two worldviews they cannot be reconciled, right? You cannot reconcile. One came from the other. And so this is a good example of like, well, if we don't actually believe that that's true, we're abandoning the world to literal spiritual darkness. And the spiritual darkness brings with it impoverishment. It brings with it suffering. It brings with it chaos. And a great book, if anyone wants to read it, is by Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi, The Book That Made Your World. Had him on my podcast.
Yeah, that is a great book.
It's a great book, and it explains how this is, as the light of the Bible specifically spread throughout the world, the changes that resulted. And so I think in the past 80 or so years, Christianity has lost that perspective in favor of wokeness and a bunch of other stuff. But you can see the way that when you introduce the Bible and special revelation into the world, how it begins to transform cultures and nations. And I'm an example of that as well.
Well, the other thing that I was going to ask you about, you reminded me of this, talking about how men are superior to women because they came first and all of that. Like, obviously, that is what.
I don't know if I said that.
Yeah,
I know.
Didn't say that. And Scripture doesn't say that.
Correct.
But I've heard other people say that about the Manosphere. And if I remember correctly, you were a part of the Manosphere for a while.
It was.
And I don't really hear about the Manosphere anymore. I kind of missed it. I was busy while the Manosphere was happening, doing other stuff. And then when I looked again, it was sort of evaporated a little bit. Remind me what the Manosphere actually was and was trying to do, because it is often that our post-Christian culture, often wants to revert back to the pre-Christian worldview. And it has to rework a bunch of these presuppositions that Christianity brings. And so women, we want equality. And so in order to get rid of some Christian framework here, like God creating man first, we have to create an equality that where women are more equal than men somehow. And so female podcasts are okay, but podcasts specifically about masculinity are some sort of toxic manosphere that exists. Now, that being said, we're all guys here on the podcast, and also my listenership of the T-Rex Talk podcast is about 98% men.
Perfect.
So I don't mind telling you, just between us, we can get up to fairly toxic behavior. Like, I think it's far easier for guys to recognize that man is inherently sinful and evil.
Sure.
For some reason. We can see that in ourselves pretty clearly, especially when we're alone together. We see it real clear. So what was the Manosphere? Was the Manosphere really as terrible and toxic as it was supposedly portrayed? And what was your part in it? Like, what did it look like from the inside or the nearby?
Yeah. So I grew up in a sort of hyper feminized culture in Phoenix. And then when I lived in the Bay Area until 2016. And so I found that my upbringing failed to inform me about what it means to be a man. Now, I recognize that being a man was distinct from being a woman, but I had all these giant unanswered questions that the culture around me failed to provide me answers for. It was actually a class on Carl Jung in 2001 and the Lord of the Rings that introduced me to the notion that I, as a man, have an inner life and that's okay. That just because I'm not the pizza, beer, football guy, that doesn't mean I'm broken. Because I really believed that. I thought when I was in high school, well, I'm not really super into watching football and drinking beer. I've never been accepted by the frat guys. I must be broken as a man. And I genuinely believed that. So it was this 2001 class on Carl Jung, which touched on the Lord of the Rings, that showed me that there are all these different ways that a man can be a man. Because when you watch The Lord of the Rings, you see Aragorn and you see Gandalf and you see Boromir and Legolas and Gimli and the Hobbits. You see all these different portraits of masculinity, and all of them are presented as valid. There's no version of where it's not like Aragorn's looking at Frodo's like, I don't think you're really a man, little man. You know what I mean? Like Frodo is given a very specific...
You don't measure up. Yeah.
That's right. Well, and you don't see any of that between, Gandalf, like, hey, boomer, you don't see that from Aragorn to Gandalf, for example.
Yeah.
So you see all these different portraits of masculinity. And that was a real click for me. Like, maybe there are different ways to be a man than just this very narrow fraternity-centric kind of vision that I grew up with. Because those were the guys in high school, of course, that were the most successful at being men. They all fit into one narrow range. I never fit that. And so I thought I was broken. I discovered that, in fact, I wasn't. But I wasn't broken, but so what was I? And so I carried that question for a number of years until 2013, when I discovered what at the time was called the Mankind Project. It was a weekend men's initiation based on Jungian psychology. And I did that in 2013, and I looked around at this room full of like 100 men, realizing that my questions about what it means to be man weren't just mine. Here are all these other men, thousands of them around the world, that were struggling with the same sets of questions. Like, what's going on here? So I was carrying all these questions, and on one hand, you had the Mankind Project that talked about childhood, grief, shame, stuff like that, which was very important, men's inner life stuff. But then you had the Manosphere, which talked about fitness and finances and men's achievement in their outer lives. And I was like, these two things aren't in conflict. They actually go together. And so that's when I realized there was this worldwide rebirth of masculinity that was going on, which I called the Renaissance of Men. And so I started the podcast in 2020, just after I got baptized, because I wanted men to know that, like, hey, if you have any questions about what it means to be a man, there are thousands of men around the world that are talking about the same thing, and they're answering it from different perspectives. So I came into the Manosphere around all of these men that had been podcasters and bloggers and content creators, wanting to help them all see that you are part of something much larger than yourself. So I came into that world. I attempted to produce a documentary, which gave me the chance to meet them all in person. And so that was sort of my limited understanding. I hadn't really adopted fully a Christian worldview at the time, though I had been baptized. I came into this world looking at a bunch of men that were holding themselves up as different archetypes of masculinity. And maybe I can talk about it from that perspective.
Yeah. Well, I saw it from some sort of two perspectives. I've been involved in the gun industry for a while now,
Sure.
thanks to the T-Rex. But I was definitely following some of this stuff earlier. I've been involved in firearm stuff for a long time and living in different countries and traveling. I'd seen different cultures. But when I got back to the States, I left New Zealand at about the same time that you showed up in New Zealand. The internet was changing. Actually, no, I'm off by several years. But I was in New Zealand before you, came back right as the internet was creating alternative media platforms. And I was involved in film and television, so that was fascinating to me. So I've always kind of watched the way that some of these different types of media have developed, and the pushback from legacy media on some of the new alternative forms. But a lot of that was also cultural. Like you definitely will see institutions like education, for example. Public education in America, government schools, are so overwhelmingly run by women that in most school districts, you're going to have 90+% female teachers and administrators in a school. So you grow up being educated by women, and then you go into potentially higher education where the numbers are not quite so different, but men are not seeing men the way that they have in the past. Even like if you watch sitcoms, when was the last time you watched a sitcom when the dad was a respectable breadwinner and not just kind of the butt of the wife's jokes? Mm-hmm. Maybe Tim Allen, which is why Disney hates Tim Allen so much nowadays. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes he was kind of Tim Allen falls into the buffoon category, like most sitcom guys. So like this is the world that legacy media creates. And so when I see alternative media coming about, podcasting and stuff like that, I see legacy media like attacking the bros who are doing this stuff, and the bros are filling a need. And the first group of bros that I saw in the fringe might have been the I forget what they're called now, but it is those people pursuing the one night stands.
The pickup community.
The pickup community was the first kind of alternative masculine group that I saw show up, and they were largely all reprehensible characters that appeared in pretty much every way that you could imagine. And then I kind of lost track of it for a little while, and then I came back, and it was neo-pagan bodybuilders who were getting a huge amount of the attention. And so I kind of ignored the Manosphere, and for once in my life, I saw criticisms from legacy media and the feminist world that were like, yeah, they actually kind of have a point about some of these guys. And I was very focused on other stuff at the time, other work at the time. And so when I looked again, there was no Manosphere. So what exactly happened? What happened to all that stuff? Because it's not like the world got nicer to men and men found a new, like fantasy football did not solve men's need for masculine exploits. Video games did not completely solve our desire for taking dominion. Why did the Manosphere go away? What happened?
That you just in that you made a really important observation, which was the Manosphere was a collection of different men that were setting themselves up as archetypes of masculinity. So maybe you as a man don't resonate with the one night stand kind of nightclub playboy of the pickup community. Maybe you prefer the pagan bodybuilding bros, with sort of a more Viking aesthetic. Or maybe you like the beards and baseball cap outdoor kind of woodsman. Or maybe you're more the entrepreneur type. So if no matter what kind of man that you sort of identified as, whatever your tribe or subculture was, there was an archetype within the Manosphere that would appeal to you. So each of these guys had their own little niche, their own little silo of the kind of men that they were trying to appeal to, remaking masculinity in their own image, right? So ultimately, those formed like cults of personality and various forms of masculine idolatry. So you asked what happened to the Manosphere. Well, what actually happened is the Manosphere started Christianizing right around the time when I showed up. So like 2021,
okay.
And the 21 convention was probably the biggest Manosphere convention. And so I spoke there in 2021. Michael Foster spoke there, and there were a number of other Christian speakers as well. So Christianity flowed into the Manosphere in part as a result of COVID. People are recognizing wokeness, and they're sort of having an awareness that wokeness is a religion. Christianity intuitively offers an escape from wokeness for a lot of men. So the Manosphere, Christianity flowed into the Manosphere. And when that happened in 2022, something else came with it. And so that was Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate had previously been a fringe character, like a side character, and was quite entertaining as a side character. But he decided he wanted to be the main character. And in 2022, he showed up being the guy who did all of the things that the other guys only talked about. So other guys talked about making money. Andrew Tate was a multi-hundred millionaire. Other guys talked about physical fitness, and he was a pro fighter. Other guys talked about having lots of women. He was a human trafficker, right? But, he was certainly his own version of Playboy. He was the guy who had done all the things that all the other guys just talked about.
Interesting, yeah.
And so he came over the top, massive media push, and he sucked all the air and all the money out of it, right? And everyone's like, oh, that's the dude, right? He was elevated by the media and everything. So everyone flowed to Andrew Tate just as Christianity flows in. So what that did was it broke the Manosphere in half. You have some guys go down the Andrew Tate path, some guys go down the Christianity path, and everyone else gets their lunch eaten. And then what's only left of the Manosphere now is the zombified remains of the pickup red pill era, which is Rollo Tomassi and Fresh and Fit. Prior to when it started talking about husbands and fathers and virtue, all those guys have either started following Andrew Tate or have become Christian. And all that's left is like, well, pick up girls and, and kind of be angry about feminism. That's a zombified version of a much earlier version of the Manosphere. And that's what's left.
Interesting. Yeah.
I got thrown out, by the way. I got kicked out of the Manosphere.
Well, I didn't realize that it was as formal an organization, because I've seen the left claim formal organizations in places where they aren't any. Like I remember back in the early 2000s, people were super freaked out about a new brand of homeschooling called the Quiverful Movement. And they were like, who's the leader of the Quiverful Movement? And like, it's really it's just people who have a lot of kids. Like there is no grand master. Now, interestingly, Elon Musk and other people have talked about the need for higher fertility rates. But prior to that, like the quiverful movement was not a thing. Like it wasn't a cult. It was just people who believed that children were a blessing and just had more kids than average. So I'm used to the left deciding that there is some sort of vast right-wing conspiracy here or cult over there. So I'm a little bit surprised that the Manosphere ended up being as organized as it was.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
So, yeah.
I don't know that there was any singular leader of the Manosphere. There was a guy who appointed himself the president of the Manosphere, but that was a self-appointed title, and he had no real "quote unquote" authority. It was just something he arrogated to himself.
It's also very unimaginative. He could have been, the life emperor supreme of the Manosphere or something like that. It would have been a lot more colorful.
Well, he tried to remake himself in Trump's image, so that was kind of his persona. There was no formal leader of the Manosphere. It was probably a loose association of accomplished men in various respects. There was a status hierarchy of men who had accomplished more, had larger followings on YouTube, or had a more successful book. So there were junior and senior members. Like there's a status hierarchy like any organization of men, but there was never any formal structure or leadership to it. It was a bunch of men who were loosely allied with each other to try and answer the same sets of questions for different kinds of men. And so I came into that trying to say, hey, do you guys all see that you're all talking about the same thing from different angles? And they liked the idea conceptually, but ultimately it's like, hey, we got our own little things going on here, and we don't need to be, compared to each other in terms of standards. Yeah.
Well, so this also brings another point. We spoke earlier on your podcast. I haven't actually checked to see if your podcast is out yet.
It's not.
If that episode is available. So I'll pretend like I should have pretended like I was about to then, just for chronology. But when we talked, I did not say this to you on your podcast because it would be rude to say this. But I will say this on my podcast.
Okay.
I don't really like podcasts or podcasting that much.
You're in the wrong business, I'm afraid.
Well, it's a great way to do a certain thing, which is to show people that these kinds of conversations are helpful, normal, men should be engaging in them, etc. However, there's a tendency that I think that is really easy to fall into to say, like, I don't need friends because I listen to Will Spencer's friends or Isaac's friends or other people's friends. That's the friendship that I need. And it's not a two-way thing. Or to say that, well, I get a sermon every week from my favorite podcaster. Now my church needs are being met. So there's a downside to what podcasting has become. As much as I like having conversations, and I think that there's value in making some of those conversations public and can be encouraging and edifying to folks, I do think there is an over-reliance on podcasting for fellowship. And podcasting is not fellowship. I mean, it's kind of fellowship for you and me, but nobody listening is engaged. It's vicarious fellowship. It's not real. There's no. You're missing something that is, I believe, a really important part of being a man is not just hearing from other men, but this discipleship and this two-way iron sharpening iron. And being involved in community. And so that is something that I think that a manosphere per se that is focused on podcasting networks is just never going to meet that need. It's never going to actually build those kind of relationships that are really, really necessary. And so that is one of the things that I really like. You mentioned the Fight Laugh Feast conference earlier. It started out as a podcast network, and it still is one, but that they have conferences is, I think, really neat. And it's not just for the podcasters to come and hang out, even though we did talk there, but it's for the listeners to come and hang out. It is a very different thing, I think, than I've seen for some, like YouTube creator events are only for the creators. They're not for the fans. And I love the idea that we get back to men being involved in their communities, men being involved in their churches, men having conversations like they have seen on the podcasts with the other men in their community, not just with guys who have achieved greatness in certain places, in certain areas. Now, that's great for inspirational purposes, but it's not great for the actual community support that the guys should be doing for one another. So, I just thought I'd mention that on my podcast and not on yours, because it feels a little more polite to be like, here's a problem that I'm contributing to.
Well, you're right. And I think the way that I think about this is what happened in COVID was, I mentioned earlier, the world went into lockdown. And we all got very isolated from each other. We went into our homes, and workplaces moved on to Zoom, which is an entirely negative transition. But still, like, everyone suddenly got very divided from each other. But one of the ways that we got very divided from each other was around the question of the moral legitimacy of what was going on. So you had a lot of men who were like, no, this is wrong, and I won't accept any restrictions on my ability to move, and I won't accept this new quote unquote passport that is being forced upon me in order to do all the things that I used to do. Hard no, I want to have nothing to do with it. And those men suddenly found that they were friends with other men who were like, yeah, no, I think this is fine and we should just go along with it. And so men that had known each other for a very long period of time suddenly found that they were on the other side of not just a political conversation, because I think prior to COVID, Republicans and Democrats probably could have gotten along. But suddenly they found that they were on the other side of a very important moral, legal, economic, social, cultural, theological, in a sense, issue. And so that increased the sense of isolation. Like, I don't even know if I can trust my own family or my own best friend anymore. Ben lost lifelong relationships over that, right? And so I think what that did was that created a greater sense of isolation of people being like, well, like, who can I trust? I have all these friends and I don't want to ask them how they felt about this whole thing because I might blow up this really good relationship. So what people turned to in the COVID era for community was they turned to podcasts. They turned to siloed podcasts of listening to men who they knew that they would agree with, having long, in-depth conversations to facilitate a sense of community that they didn't have otherwise have. But now we are firmly in the post-COVID era. We are supposed to forget that. In fact, we're supposed to forget that ever happened. Oh, that whole thing, whatever. And so now I think that there's a want to rediscover in-person community. And so I think that's probably another reason why I think interview style podcasts are probably going to struggle going forward, except for a few key winners. That's not to say there isn't value in having the conversations, but I think people are ready to finally, like, kind of like Groundhog Day, pop up out of their holes and look around and be like, okay, well, I see that guy wearing a MAGA hat and I see that guy over there, like, he's got a wife and kids. Maybe we can go start talking again. And so I think we're going to see a renewal of in-person community. And I think the big decisive factor that has changed that is also a resurgent Christian church, particularly in the Reformed tradition. Now, there will be challenges there as well, but I think we're finally ready to leave behind socializing by proxy in favor of actual real world relationships again.
Yeah, I agree. And I look forward to that. Another thing that I think that the COVID, the ripples or the fractures that we saw highlights is there were a lot of men who were friends with each other because they watched football together. And we thought that, we were butting heads and we were iron sharpening iron. But it was just over, like, our fantasy football picks. And so once there was an actual conflict, then it wasn't something that people were ready for. It wasn't something we're like, well, we already went through this that time that this happened. Like, no, we had never gone through that sort of thing before. And so there's a lot of, I'm convinced that we're still going to see ripples for a long time. And one of them that is about to happen or is continuing to happen is during COVID, a whole bunch of churches just shut down. And what happened for months and months and months at a time of no church or internet church is the people who were going to those, and I would contend mediocre churches shut down, courageous churches stayed open, and it's that simple. It's more complicated in certain places. Like, I know people who went to jail in Canada. The Canadian government was hunting outdoor churches with helicopters during COVID. It was more complicated in some places than others, but courageous churches stayed open and sometimes were creative about where they met, and wimpy churches shut down. Now, at the very beginning, I think it was wise for churches to be like, hang on, we don't know what's going on. Let's do Zoom church for a little while. But churches who just bent the knee to their respective governments and said, we will forsake the body in contradiction of Scripture because you've asked us to. I think that was the wrong move. And what happened was strong Christians in wimpy churches left and found strong churches. Wimpy Christians in wimpy churches, to a large degree, did not come back to in-person church 12 months later or however long it was for them. And so there's a bunch of wimpy churches that no longer have tithers. And when they run out of tithe money is just a question of what their savings were. But I think that there was a great winnowing of the church around the world, particularly in Western culture, where we will see what looks like a gigantic decline in church-going activity, but it will be some of these wimpier churches. And we will see a tremendous strengthening of people who were going to wimpy churches. They were strong Christians, but they just weren't getting the meat. They just weren't getting the teaching. They just weren't getting the kind of fellowship they needed. And COVID made them seek out strong churches, like it was the only ones that were still meeting. So if they desperately wanted to be in fellowship with other Christians, they went to churches that had a backbone. And I think that that's some of the fruit that we're seeing at this point as well. So, yeah, it's all of these things that have happened. Like, it's very easy to say, like, yeah, we did that thing for like 18 months, and let's just forget it ever happened. Let's forget that we made your grandparents die alone in a hospital, and let's just pretend like it never happened to go back to normal. There's all kinds of stuff that I think has been irrevocably changed in our culture, and the results are still going to be popping up. We're still going to see results that were previously unnoticed appear. And I'm really curious about the future. But I will get back to belaboring my point. Like, I hope people are listening to this podcast and enjoying it, because I think it's a fun conversation. But they also need to have these conversations in real life with people that they actually know, and they should be having these conversations around bigger issues than fantasy football, so that the next time something like COVID comes around, we've already had these heart-filled conversations. We've already had difficult conversations. We've already talked about lines in the sand. We've already had disagreements. We've already overcome the fact that I think you have a dumb take about something that's a bigger deal than football, and we've gotten past that. I think these things are absolutely required for civilization to exist and continue to move forwards.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really important there, that there is actually still value to podcasts. And this is how I conceive of it with my podcast, is that there's this thing called chemistry that happens between two or more men. And chemistry is a funny thing. Sometimes it can really, really work, and you can achieve heights of conversation that are truly special, where you discover mutually, you discover truths, or you discover realities that neither of you had previously considered, or you get the chance to bounce ideas off of each other. And suddenly you find that through the chemistry of two men, you're creating a greater synthesis than you had previously achieved with your own ideas, and something truly special happens. It's like capturing lightning in a bottle. There's a performative aspect. There's a performative aspect to it, but it's not really performative because you can't really perform it. It's not an act. You're being yourself, and the other person is being themselves. And if that works, that spirals up in a very beautiful way. And I think that's something that men should aspire to in their own lives. And I think it's something unique that can happen between two men on a podcast that can get, God willing, captured and experienced by other people vicariously. And I think that is the unique new art of podcasting, that to make possible the capturing of those moments that wasn't possible ever before in human history, not to the same extent. Yeah. So, but the number of podcasts that can actually achieve that is very small. Now, any podcast, it could happen. A lot of people are trying to make it happen, but very few people actually can do it. They have whatever the skills are necessary to do it. So if you can do that, If you know what that is, I mean, everyone probably can think right now of a podcast that they've listened to where they felt that happen. Like something special is happening right now. The one that comes to mind for me is when Elon Musk did that first space with Donald Trump. It was maybe a week or two after the assassination. It was just 45 minutes, but I think we could all feel, I could anyway, and that was just a Twitter space. That was just audio only. I could feel in myself something special is happening right now between these two men. And it was a very warm feeling. It was in a very good way, like a fireside chat. People compared it to like when we're all gathered around the radio generations past listening, to whatever. And that was very special. And those can still happen. And that's why I think there's art and value in podcasting to be able to bring two men together or more who can create a moment between them that wouldn't otherwise be possible. I think we're having a good conversation now because you and I have met in person. This would be very different if it was the first time we'd ever connected. So I think there's value in that. But also that artistic experience can go along with, for example, watching a great movie, reading a good book, looking at a painting, engaging with photography, etc. It's just one media art form among many. And so not to lose sight of only appreciating, well, I will only watch movies. It's like, well, no, there are lots of different art forms that we can appreciate. And I think podcasting will slowly find its way into the right place for where it fits in culture now that we're free to be social again and be free about our opinions also.
And there's another cool thing about podcasting, which is that you can listen to a podcast while you do other stuff. Correct. And audiobooks do this, but there's plenty of visual media where you can't quite do this. And a thing that I dislike about the off the top of the head conversational podcasts is they're not very information dense. Right. Like you could squeeze this information into a much smaller space to communicate the stuff that we're talking around. But if I'm working a production job, and I know this firsthand, if I'm working a production job at T-Rex on the line, a conversation that is not super densely packed information is much easier for me to actually stay on task and absorb information than if I listen to a super complex philosophy audiobook while trying to make holsters. Those two things don't go together. So
that's right.
There are great opportunities today with modern technology to have a hour-long, 2-hour-long conversation between other people, listen to it at, maybe 1.25 speed, maybe you speed it up a little bit, depending on the task that you're doing, depending on the information density that's there, and do something while you're working with your hands, which was previously not possible. So I think it's good. I think it's exciting, but I do want to make sure that we don't let podcasting take the place of relationships, take the place of fellowship that you really need to be working on. And hopefully podcasts are an example. Like hopefully listening to people think out loud as the other guest or host brings them something they've not thought about, and they take the knowledge that they do have and they use logic to try to think out loud. I think that is a great example because logic is a bit of a lost art in Western civilization now. And so listening to people with differences of opinion grapple with ideas is often, it's not always a great example, but oftentimes it is sort of like, oh, this is what this looks like. Oh, this is how you do this. Well, this is how you do this stuff, because you maybe didn't see that in school, for example.
The ability in a conversation, chemistry is part of it, but the ability to draw something interesting out of somebody that they haven't touched on before. So sometimes my podcast will get up to 5 hours long. My longest podcast is 5 hours. I happen to quite enjoy long. Yeah, some people, they couldn't talk for that long. They couldn't listen for that long. Like, Will, how do you expect me to listen to this? I don't know, but we just did it. So, but in that time, what I've found, and it's different for every interview that I do, but some of the interviews, they don't actually, this is going to be hard to hear. Some of the interviews don't actually get going until around hour 2 or 3. Because when you're when you're meeting someone for the first time, maybe we've exchanged some emails, maybe we've sent some tweets back and forth. During the course of 2 hours, people get a sense when, for example, when they're on my podcast, they get a sense of who I am because they're meeting me for the first time. And actual genuine rapport gets to be built. And so as that rapport gets built and the comfort and the feelings of familiarity grow, it becomes possible to address ideas that are otherwise unformed So it's like, well, I'm kind of playing around with this idea, and now I'm going to give it a chance to I'm going to speak it out loud and see what happens. But also like a feeling of like, if I ask you this really sensitive question, you've spent 5 hours with me so that you know my intentions. And so that, and that I think is really important, because that creates an opportunity for accomplished, successful, intelligent men, to share things they wouldn't otherwise get the opportunity to in the format of an interview. So there is a unique opportunity there. But you say very rightly that, especially when it comes to matters of faith, and I've addressed this multiple times on my show, if you're listening to Christian podcasts, do not use a podcast as a substitute for going to an actual church. Don't think that just because you listen to a YouTube sermon, that's all you have to do as a Christian. No, you're called to be part of a community, to submit yourself to authority and to leadership, and to not simply be out in the wilderness being like, well, I got my daily dose of Christianity through the internet, so I'm good. It's like, no, Christianity is what you do offline. As Michael Foster and I did a podcast about this earlier this year, about being an offline Christian. Go to a church, become a member, participate, pray, sing, read the Bible, be part of a shepherding group, all of these things. It's necessary to do all those things. And again, listening to podcasts and content online can create the simulation of that, but it's not the actual thing. It's a supplement, not a substitute. And in COVID, it was all we had, in many different ways, like in terms of socializing, in terms of community, it was all we had. Now that's over. And so if you continue leaning on that and you don't actually begin building in-person networks, church and otherwise, then you are using it as a substitute, and you're being safe. You're shying back from a challenge. And so I encourage men to not do that and to step bravely into being parts of communities and churches.
Yeah. Get plugged in and then be willing to have hard conversations. I'm hoping that also, now I want to do this delicately. I'll use the how we started the podcast as an example, because we could have either started this podcast on that topic one of two ways. They're both great engagement farming ways to do a podcast. We could have brought up the Maori party in Parliament a couple of days ago, and we could have bought ourselves some points by dunking on them. And just deriding them and making jokes, because our audience wants that kind of material from us. Or we could have bought ourselves some points with legacy media by talking about why the Maori are the most protected class and should continue to be the most protected class. Like, we could have done either of those two things for the wrong motives. But what I really think that you can't fake is if you're really pursuing truth and wanting to speak in love to your listeners who are watching this. I think that there's really no way to fake that. Like, it's obvious that we're both sympathetic to the Maori people, but we also think that this thing was very silly. And there really should be a way where you don't just take a middle road because it's the least offensive, or pick a side because it's the easiest way to get podcast listeners, but that you actually are pursuing truth on this issue. And the reason that I think that it's hard to fake is it's so hard to do for real that it's really obvious if you're trying to do it for real.
Yes. Well, so, if you make a living, and you can generate engagement via hot takes, the incentive is to continue to get hotter and hotter and hotter. That's just how it works, right? Or if you build your brand based on that, I don't think, maybe you can make a lot of money doing that, but I don't think that that's a way to live, because how you create content feeds into other areas of your life. And so if you've built your working time identity on top of hot takes, what are the odds that you're going to turn off the lights at the end of the day and turn around to your wife and kids or friends and not continue that? At some point, there's going to be some momentum that just carries the hot takes over into your household. And and so then it kind of takes over, right? Well, this is just how I am. Versus the sincere pursuit of truth is sustainable when the camera's on and when the camera's off. Now, is it as sensational? No. Is it as sexy? No. Is it going to get as much engagement? No. But you will have actually achieved something meaningful, if only for yourself and for the listeners, that people can keep going back to, and that hopefully won't age. Hot takes age. They get old. Like no one's going back and listening to someone's hot take from 5 years ago. If we've forgotten, we're hopped up on the latest one. But people will go back and they'll listen to, like, for example, Jordan Peterson's 2017 podcast with Joe Rogan. Like, that's a legendary, maybe 2017, 2018. Those were probably two of the best podcasts ever. And I would imagine they would stand the test of time because they're not there trying to share hot takes. They're trying to mutually discover truth. And so again, there's the slow road to prosperity, or there's the quick road to affluence. Those are the two big questions we're dealing with in the culture, right? Yeah. You can print a bunch of money, or you can learn a skill and earn a bunch of money, right? And so, I mean, we can talk about that as well, how that shows up in a governmental sense. But this is virtue versus sensationalism, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. So circling back to kind of how we started. I feel terrible cutting you off now that you've talked about how much you enjoy long conversations.
That's okay. That's what I do on my show.
Exactly. Unfortunately, it's Monday when we're recording this. I have a regular job to do. This is a side effect. Being able to have these conversations as part of TRX Talks is a wonderful side effect of what I am doing with TRX. But I do have other stuff to do. So. In future, we'll get back together.
Fake news.
And talk for longer. We'll talk for longer. But let's just finish on New Zealand for a bit. Because I do want people to understand that we don't want to do hot takes about the news in New Zealand. You lived there for years. I lived there for years. In many ways, this place is a bit like home. Mm-hmm. It's not where we live now, but we have a deep love and affection for the people who do live there. And I have a deep love and affection for people who used to be part of the ACT Party. The ACT Party is like the Libertarian Party of New Zealand. They were the ones that put forward the bill that was torn in half and mocked. And people have said terrible things about the ACT Party. David Seymour, current leader of the ACT Party, is part Maori. So he can't, at the very least, he can't be a very good racist. Like, he's not being racist when he tries to push for equality and his part Maori at the same time. But even things like when our family first moved to New Zealand, Owen Jennings, who was a member of the ACT Party at the time, he met us and he asked my dad, like, where are you guys staying? You just got here. And Dad was like, oh, we were living in a bus while we figure out where we want to live in New Zealand. And he was like, oh, no, mate. Doreen and I have to be in Wellington because Parliament's in session. You live in my house. Like the level of friendliness and hospitability of the most hate-filled party in New Zealand to immigrants was so high that it's very sad to me to see everything being reduced to this kind of cartoonish level of stuff. And the love that I have for the Maori people that I came to know and went to church with and is very high, and to see the level of cartoonish kind of Disneyfication that is happening to their actual history offends me on their behalf. I hope it's not just annoyance or an opportunity to do hot takes. Mm-hmm. But your thoughts on the situation?
I agree. I mean, I think New Zealand is a wonderful country that I love very much. It's a very big and complicated country for how small it is. South Island versus the North Island, what the extreme North Island, Cape Reinga is like compared to the extreme South Island and Bluff. Like there's a lot to it. And there's a lot to it historically. There's a lot to it culturally. And it makes me sad, genuinely, to see that since 2020, since COVID, people's associations with New Zealand have been Jacinda Ardern, COVID tyranny, right? Some of the worst COVID tyranny in the whole world took place in New Zealand. And now you see this painfully cringe woke haka-ness that's communicating a completely wrong vision of what Kiwis are like. And I don't just mean in Auckland. Like, Auckland is its own world. Half of the population of New Zealand lives in the city of Auckland. The rest of it is scattered all throughout both islands, with the majority in the North Island. But I have such great appreciation for the extreme North Island. Like I said, Cape Reinga is one of my favorite places on earth. I love the South Island. I have incredible memories of driving to the South Island, right? In a camper van, right? A sleeper camper van, right? And so to see this great country that I treasure, that I love, that I value very much, that I was going to make my second home, be painted in such a way to the world, it pains me greatly. And I don't think that people who are pushing for this kind of woke ideas are truly being sensitive to who New Zealand is. They're thinking more about the Maori people, but New Zealand is so much more than that. And I hope that New Zealand rediscovers its will to be itself. Right, if they want to focus on Aotearoa, that's fine. But maybe we can focus on New Zealand also, the brave settlers who carved civilization out of a distant wilderness. New Zealand is, like you said, it's the most remote. It's the most remote colony from England. It's quite far. It's quite far from anything, really. And so I think Kiwis don't know how to appreciate that aspect of their heritage. And they've been so busy pushing the Maori through the haka, which is, again, as you said, like a keyhole vision of what Maori culture is like. They've been so busy pushing that, they've lost, like, who are we as Kiwis? And I really do hope they have the pride to discover who they are as a nation and share that with the world as well. Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. There's so much that's there, and New Zealand is young enough that we'll see what happens. But I'm thinking about Christchurch, the city, the biggest city in the South Island. It's not a huge city. It was like 300,000 people when we were there last. It was devastated by an earthquake, and all these early 1900s, late 1800s building stone churches and Christ College and schools, and the main cathedral in town very significantly, heavily damaged. And there was a lot of conversation about how to rebuild. And some of the conversation was very legitimate conversation, just like granted, buildings are not the most earthquake-proof buildings. Like, what is the best way to build earthquake-proof in the future? But a lot of the conversation was, whatever we do, let's take this opportunity to get away from the Christian heritage of the settlers of Christchurch. Let's pick a new style. Let's rename some of these roads. Let's not have Cranmer Square and Latimer Square. Let's not have roads that are named after great martyrs of the faith. Let's rename them something. Let's start naming stuff Maori names, even though there weren't really Maori down here this far south. Let's do this thing. Let's rebuild everything with sea containers. Let's paint everything bright colors. Let's try to create a new style for Christchurch. This is our chance to kind of remake it in a slightly different image. And I believe that there's been the pendulum again has swung a little bit back, where people are like, oh no, but let's rebuild the cathedral the way that it was. Let's try to hang on to some of but just the sort of knee-jerk reaction of certain people in New Zealand to be like, oh, finally those churches and finally those street names, we have a good excuse to get rid of those things and try to pretend like it never happened. And New Zealand is entirely a European city of the future with no connection to the past. Was very tragic. Very tragic to see. And the frustrating thing is, it doesn't look any different when I see people taking Maori culture and recasting it in some kind of Disneyland tiki style that does not line up with what the missionaries wrote when they got there, and they documented how people were living and what they believed and how they were and the things that they were excellent at and the things that were horrific. But the true record should be maintained, and it shouldn't be erased. On the behalf of our children going into the future, we should remember the ancestors of the past. All of the noble, but also all of the ignoble stuff should be remembered, so that we actually have a true record of history and we can do proper honor to our forebears. Even our forebears who were brutal pagans, like my slightly more distant ancestors were. This is the real, actual history of the world, and what was a truly civilizing influence needs to be recorded along with how people actually behaved and acted. And so, yeah, it is it is something that is very, very important to me that we do that as people and as Christians. And yeah, this was just an interesting one to watch from afar. Hit a little close to home because I was like, I know some of these people, and there are Maori politicians who are being thrown under the bus for criticizing that haka. And they're not guys that I agree with on a lot of issues. They're labor politicians and guys, or some of them independents. I'm thinking of Winston Peters. Winston Peters and I have butted heads on a couple of issues, but he's a New Zealand statesman who's been around for a long time and represented his people well as he, with true to his own values. And they're calling him a racist because he thought the haka was silly, that was performed in the middle of parliamentary procedure. So just even just stuff like that is happening is bugs me. I know I'm not allowed to be bugged because I'm an American, but technically I am a dual citizen. And this is kind of interesting. When you become a New Zealand citizen from you weren't a naturalized born citizen. Technically, I am not Pākehā. Technically, I am a person of the land. Now, obviously, my ancestry is not Polynesian, but I have a slightly different legal status as a person of the land, as a citizen who comes in afterwards. So it doesn't mean anything in the cultural sideshow that is going on, but it's just a weird legal footnote.
You have to wear your greenstone necklace.
I have to do all the things to fit in. I have to work on my accent, all that stuff. It's been a long time since I've been back in New Zealand, and feels like folks are just making it less desirable to go back all the time, which is a great frustration.
I agree. Yeah, if I can just add something on to what you said.
Oh yeah.
The cultural relativism that seems to have taken over demands an objective standard to measure cultures by. And the only objective standard that we can measure by is Scripture, is the Bible. And I think what we're going to see is we're seeing a rising interest in Christianity, and praise God for that. I will be curious to see what happens as this interest in Christianity rises, whether people will really go all the way with it, men, women, whatever, and begin comparing themselves to an objective standard. Christianity sounds really nice until you actually have to do the thing and recognize where you're at in God's eyes. And then maybe it sounds less nice. But I think part of what's going on in New Zealand is they just abandon their Christian heritage, not unlike, many nations in the world, including America. And so I think there's a crying out that needs to happen to saying, okay, well, we're not just going to give our cultural capital over to the Maori because they're victims, because we see where that leads. That has not led to a good place internationally, right? It hasn't led to a good look. And whatever I haven't heard the name Winston Peters in a long time, and and whatever anyone may call him racist thinks, it wasn't a good look for your nation on the world stage, period. And I don't think that there's any way to argue that. So there's got to be a question well, who are we as Kiwis going to be? In the same way that America is asking, who are we as Americans going to be? In the same way that I hope France, after the debacle of the Olympics, is asking, who are we as French going to be? In the same way that England, they're being completely taken over. You listen to Father Calvin Robinson talk about that, or even Nigel Farage. I think Nigel Farage said this past weekend something about like England is over or something like that. And so there's a big question that a lot of these Western nations are asking, who are we going to be, right? Are we just going to assert cultural dominance out of our own strength? Or are we actually going to assert a timeless, objective, universal standard to measure by, including ourselves? And that's what I hope happens, right? That's what the Manosphere rejected. That's why the Manosphere failed. They all wanted to be the man, the standard that every other man was measured by. And of course, Christ shows up and says, actually, guys, it's me. Well, I don't like that. And then they throw that out. And so my hope is that with this rising awareness of Christianity, whether it be in the Manosphere or whether it be culturally or internationally, that people have the courage to measure themselves against that standard and repent. That would be real change. And I think the following Trump's election, we have the chance for that to happen. Not that he himself is going to be the guy to do that, but there's a window open for that to happen, which is very powerful. And that gets back to your point of the only way that we can do that is podcasts can encourage you to go to church, but that process happens in church. So like when you're done listening, go to church and engage with that process. And that's how we'll really create change.
Yes. Well, I keep saying we'll finish on it, but I have another thought.
Keep going.
This is a fascinating thing. Yeah, I know you're gonna want to keep going.
I don't got a production line to work on. Go for it.
There is Black Friday comes when no man can rest. There is this very interesting thought, and New Zealand is in some ways a little bit at the forefront of this, but what is, if you don't have that objective standard, if you throw out the Bible, you throw out a written standard, if you throw out cultural heritage, if you throw out the Bible, how do you even define cultural heritage? And one of the issues that New Zealand is running into or will have to address at some point is what actually is a Maori, because Maori culture is something that has changed over time because they didn't have a written language. It's something that has changed a lot since the 80s, since anthropologists started sort of reshaping it. There aren't full-blood Maori, so it can't be a truly ethnic thing. And there's a lot of folks that come from Vanuatu and Fiji. One of my best friends in New Zealand that I really appreciate, this guy, he came from the Christian church in Tuvalu, and he immediately plugged into the Maori community because there are all kinds of cultural connections that exist. But yeah, he's not technically Maori. Like, he was not part of the Treaty of Waitangi. He was far, far away in one of the little islands. When Pacific Islanders are just a group that gets put together because of melanin count, that's such a very silly thing to build legal rights around. And it's just such an incredibly unprecise thing. It's just whatever the people agree that it is at any given time. And so this person from the Maori Party is allowed to do this thing, and Winston Peters and David Seymour, who are part Maori, are not allowed to talk about it because they just don't fit some constantly changing criteria. You have chaos and madness. That objective standard is just inescapably required. So what I want to talk to you about in the future, as you've traveled around different countries, seen different cultural groups who are less tainted by just constantly evolving cultural in definition, what are some of the ways that people did hang on to stuff? Like, what were some of the standards that some of these non-Christian groups had, or physical borders or things like that? What are some immovable things? Over a long enough time, nothing's immovable. But what are some of the things that did actually work to be a touchstone or an anchor? That would be interesting for us to think about and discover, because there's so much conversation about this as the pendulum swings back and forth between postmodernism. Are we going to be this kind of culture, that kind of culture? We're going to identify with a podcaster. Are we going to have borders? Who are we going to allow in? We live in a very different world than a few hundred years ago. Physical borders used to be a great way of defining people groups before you could just fly around the world in hours. So even the way that we think about some of these things, we need to get back to Scripture to consider, and not just be like, well, in the 1800s, it was super easy to just say, well, you didn't spend 6 months on a boat, so you're not here now.
That's right. That's exactly. Well, so just two quick responses to that. The first thing is that you asked what sort of touch points were really helpful for me. Excuse me. The first was in South America. And South America is very proud. Latin America is very proud of its men are men and women are women. Right. That was that's a big part of their culture. It's a very, maybe saying it's sexualized is probably too strong, but there's an appreciation for the beauties of women and the strength of men. That's just part of Latin American culture. So going from San Francisco, where that doesn't exist, straight to South America and seeing that, particularly in Colombia, was like a big wake up call. Like, you mean feminism isn't this universal galactic imperative? So that was what first started trying to crack my worldview open. And regarding you said about New Zealand culture and how do the Maori and the Tuvalu and Vanuatuans, how do they establish this has parallels in the New Age world. Like I started out talking about this big soup that all the New Age is in. So Buddhism and Hinduism and Burning Man is a part of that. There is a single binding ethic that holds them all together. right? And that binding ethic is we are not Christianity. So we are not white patriarchal Christianity. So we may not know what we are relative to each other, but together we know we're not that. It is true enmity. It's true enmity to a thing that creates in an absence of any other binding ethic. It does create that. So this is the wokeness that was kind of overthrown. This idea of like, we're going to take over the world and defeat whiteness is what they called it forever. And they lost. But that doesn't mean like in this election is what I'm talking about. That doesn't mean the battle's over. But so this binding ethic that can bring together so many disparate groups that would otherwise seem to have nothing in common is enmity to a particular thing. And that was true in the New Age. That will probably be true in a lot of the cultural wars we're going to be facing in the years to come also.
Well, let's make that our next conversation. We'll have a 5-hour conversation. Like you like, but we'll break it up over time, like I like, and that'll be our compromise.
Fair.
Thank you so much, Will, for being on the show, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness talking about so many of these different things. I've listened to episodes of your show now where you've done that with different folks. For all of my criticism of podcasts, there is this great value. I have met Michael Foster in person, but I haven't been able to have a long conversation with him. So listening to somebody else that I know have a long conversation with him is a close second. Like, it is a good way to get to know him better and understand what he's thinking better. So I don't want to just throw podcasts completely under the bus, but by all means, get out and have these kind of conversations with other people. Those of you who are listening, and I guess you can hear some more of this conversation happen whenever my appearance on your podcast goes live. So where can people find that? Where should we send people?
The best place to go is willspencer.co/links. That will be the best place to find YouTube, the podcast, where I am on social media, my Substack. That you can just go to willspencer.co/links and you can find all of that.
Very good. Thank you so much again, Will. You are winning me over. We've talked for almost 2 hours. I've only changed the lighting 4 times in this particular one recording. So you're winning me over. You're winning me over to your side. And I would like to keep talking about like nice places to get fish and chips on the North Island, some of the things that so we could have that kind of podcast too. It would be fun. But next time we'll talk about cultural touchstones, national identity. We'll make it serious because you are a well-traveled guy. You're thoughtful and you're talking to people that have given this some serious consideration. So I'd love to pick your brain on that issue next time we talk.
Praise God, brother. Thank you. I'm grateful to God for giving me these experiences and giving me something to do to share them. So thank you so much.